As investors, we have multiple tools at our disposal, and one of those tools is known as the Early Occupation Agreement. In this quick education, I'm going to take you through what this agreement is, when and why we would use it, and what the risks involved. I educate people to reach financial freedom through property through cash flow positive investments, specializing in the low-income multi-let residential market. Early occupation is an agreement between the buyer and the seller and is very common in many property transactions. Simply put, it refers to the terms and conditions of the seller occupying the property before the transfer or registration has taken place. So the big question, why would you ever want to do this? Usually it's because the buyer wants to access the property before transfer for a variety of reasons. It could be because it's convenient. The person wants to move in there because they want to live there and they want to start putting their furniture in there. Maybe it's that they want to get in and renovate the property before transfer so that once transfer happens, they can move in, or some sort of personal circumstance. I've used the early occupation clause twice for two different use cases. The first one was because of student housing. Now, students is a great strategy and very lucrative, but it can be quite complicated to get right. And one of the things you have to get right with student housing is the timing. Right, because students start renting from Feb, March, depending on when the university new year starts. So if you're buying a property in the 1st of January and it's going to take 3 or 4 months to transfer, let's say it transfers into your name in April, you've missed that window to be able to market for and place tenants. So we used the early occupation clause to ensure that the property transferred into our names before the school year started, giving us ample time to market, vet, and place students. The other use case was when I did flipping. I wanted to make sure that I got into the property as quick as possible, did all my renovations so that when transfer happened, I could already put it back onto the market to resell and have a quick turnaround time. Now, because the buyer and the seller are, for all intents and purposes, complete strangers to each other, you need to make sure that there is clear consent and a written agreement. This strategy requires both the buyer and the seller to have a separate agreement, separate from the OTP, as known as an early occupation agreement. And it's drafted by an attorney and specifies the terms, conditions, responsibilities, and obligations of both parties during this period. So the terms of the occupation agreement should define the duration of this period, if there is a rental figure required, and the responsibilities for maintenance, repairs, insurance, and potential penalties. The agreement should also include provisions for terminating the early occupation period, including notice periods and conditions for either party to end. As an example, here is the early occupation clause that we used for that student house that I was telling you about earlier. This is a separate agreement that was drafted by an attorney, and we all signed, the buyers and the sellers, and we all made sure that the terms and agreements were understood and accepted by all parties. So sorry, I know this is going to be a bit boring, but let's go through each clause and what it means. So provided the purchaser has paid all costs, signed all necessary bond transfer documents, delivered the guarantees, what has been called for, and is otherwise not in breach. So that's just basically saying that as the buyer, we did everything right. The occupation of the property shall be given to and taken by the purchaser at 12 p.m. on the day. So that's the first clause, is it specifying exactly when the occupation will take place. And obviously the buyer has to meet certain conditions before that is possible. If the date of occupation does not coincide with the date of transfer, the party enjoying the right of occupation whilst the property is registered in the name of the other party shall, for the period of occupation, pay the conveyances a rental of. So that's just lawyer speak of basically saying that while the buyer is occupying the seller's property during, let's call it 2 months before transfer happens, they're going to pay rent for those 2 months. That's known as occupational rent. No tenancy shall be created by the purchaser taking occupation prior to transfer, and the purchaser's right of occupation shall terminate on cancellation of the sale for whatever reason. So basically, this is just protecting the seller from the purchaser squatting in the property after a cancellation has occurred. The purchaser shall not be entitled to make any alterations or additions to the property of whatever nature prior to registration unless written permission is obtained by the seller. Now, the reason why we were okay with that clause is because we weren't going to renovate the property. It was already catered for student accommodation. If you were looking at doing the flipping strategy, you probably want to remove that clause, because the whole point of doing an early occupation is to get in there, renovate it quickly so that you can take the property back to market. The seller warrants that the property shall be maintained in the same condition from date of signature by the occupation of the purchaser. So basically just saying that if anything breaks in the time that the purchaser is occupying the property, it's the purchaser's problem to deal with. And then finally, the purchaser warrants that the property shall be maintained in the same condition. And in the last two clauses, the seller warrants and the purchaser warrants that the property shall be maintained in the condition that they found it in. So whoever leaves the property in a bad condition shall be liable to fix it. So other than the date of when the occupation takes place, the really key part of what you're going to be agreeing on is the occupational rent. So this is the requirement where the buyer has to pay the seller a monthly rental income during the period of occupation. And this should really be in line with market averages. So if the market's going to be paying roughly 10,000 Rand per month for the rental of this property, it's not fair that the seller requests 20,000 Rand during the occupation period. It obviously has to be aligned with what the market is willing to pay. There are some big risks to early occupation, and you need to consult some legal counsel to make sure that you understand all the implications. Here are some of the main risks that I'll highlight. Number one, risks of damage to the property during the occupation. Now, as the seller, this is a big risk. Right? If the purchaser comes in, breaks the property, and then leaves and disappears, and it's quite hard to get a hold of them, who's going to sit with that renovation bill? So that is quite a big risk, more on the seller's account. Insurance claims and coverage. Let's say that I, as the buyer, move into the property and, God forbid, it now burns down. And maybe I didn't get insurance during that time, and maybe the seller stopped their insurance because they thought that it was the buyer's problem. So where does the buck stop? Who is liable for that insurance claim? And then finally, probably the biggest risk, and something that I've personally seen, is if the transfer doesn't proceed for whatever reason, and any renovation work that you as the buyer have done is hard to claim back. So if you're doing the flipping strategy, as an example, you go in, you've got 2 months of occupational rent before you're going to take it to market. So you put 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 Rand into the property, you fix it up, and then a month and a half into it, actually the transfer is now cancelled. What are you going to do about that 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 Rand that you've invested? Now, it's unlikely that a transfer will be cancelled. Once the transfer documents are signed and all the guarantees have been put in place, it's a low risk, but it is something you have to be aware of. Again, please go and consult legal counsel and understand what the implications are and what your risks are. You've got to pay the professionals, you've got to hire the attorneys, and you've got to get the legal advice. As an investor, I spend a lot of money on these professionals because the only thing I should be focusing on in my business is finding money, finding deals. Everything else must be outsourced. My accounting and my taxes are done by my accountant. The operations are run by a management or a letting agency, and all of my legal affairs are paid to an attorney to deal with. So early occupation is one of our many tools in our toolbox that allows us to maneuver things in our direction, but make sure that you understand the implications of early occupation. It's really when the buyer is allowed to move into the property before transfer and they agree some sort of period and occupational rental amount. I hope you enjoyed that video. Give it a thumbs up if you did. Please go and check out my YouTube membership. You get access to exclusive content. I'll also analyze live deals on your behalf. So go check out my YouTube membership for that and so much more.